Hello everyone, it's Mr. Collins. Today we're going to continue with our New Imperialism PowerPoint, and today I'm going to be lecturing on it. First part that you guys covered was covering the key terms, the type of rule, some of the motives financially that they were looking for by going into these new colonies and these new places. Today we're going to focus more on the relationships and the things that were going on between the imperial people, the people from imperial nations, and the indigenous people of the nations in which they were looking to control. So with that, we'll start off with a poem that we are going to end up reading a little bit on Monday that became kind of a title for the New Imperialism movement, and that was the belief in the white man's burden. Now, it was dubbed this by Rudyard Kipling in the late 1800s after he wrote a poem in regards to the United States colonizing Philippines. And in it, he laid out a platform that really kind of explained how a lot of these imperial nations viewed what their purpose was in dealing with the natives of these areas and what their responsibilities was. And we'll get into that in the images up here. Now, keep in mind I put up here that the images I'm going to be showing today, a lot of political cartoons that are, let's just say, ethnically offensive and sensitive, but it's important to understand that these things were put out to understand the inherent issues that came as a result of imperial rule in these countries. So please keep that in mind as we go forward. And as we're going through the slides, please think about answering these questions as we go through, because they're the main themes that we're looking for in here. So, considering the offensive nature of the material, what messages in the pictures that we're going to see are being conveyed to the Western public about the job that their governments were undertaking by participating in imperialism and interacting with new indigenous cultures. And then the second part, in general, what do the following images that I'm going to show you represent about the indigenous cultures? True or false? What was trying to be shown in these pictures? What would be the motives behind it? So when we look at this, let's look at where this all derives from. Now, one of the big themes of the 19th century and early 20th was the idea of applying science to human nature and using this Darwinism theory that, the survival of the fittest, the stronger and weaker races, that was a thing, and that the strong were meant to dominate the weak. And because Europeans had discovered industry and factories and machines, they had developed an idea that they were by far more superior to all others. And as a result, it was nature's way that they should either destroy or dominate the other human species. So racism, right at you, this belief in superiority, white superiority, that developed. And this is even represented by the image I've shown below, where you're seeing an Irish Iberian, an African, and a British man in the middle. And even with this, just looking at the skulls of these three individuals, you can see an inherent flaw in the picture that is trying to send a different message, send a message to people that somehow that British people are more intelligent. And if you look at the picture closely, naturally they're trying to make the Irish and the Iberian and the African look more like an animal. But look at the foreheads. What is being connotated by the fact that they're portraying the British man with a bigger forehead? That he's got a bigger brain. And thus, if you have a bigger brain, you can think more and you are more intelligent. Now, we know that this was completely false, but this was some of the media images that were put out that were spinning a false narrative to people that were paying attention. Even in the advertisements, this was a soap, pear soap, that was advertised in some of these colonies. And the advertisement went, the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth. As civilization advances, while amongst the culture of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. Well, what does this say? Pretty much these people selling this, the people selling this soap, were trying to say that if you're going to go into one of these colonies where you're dealing with natives, you need to wash your hands a lot because this is a dirty part of the world. Yes, that's really what it meant. A simple soap ad. And we look at these things too. These are the political cartoons. The German one, naturally showing Africa with this, which is ridiculous. They had colonies in Africa, and this was put out in a German newspaper to represent that African culture was chaos. It was not civilized. They're running with animals like riding giraffes. And then you look over here with the bowling ball head and things like that. They're trying to portray cannibalism, which was absolutely ridiculous. People are running around naked. I mean, everything you could possibly do to stereotype and create a false narrative and a racist narrative about the African people and their civilization was done here by the Germans. And why would a German media outlet do this? Why would they put two white people in a cage when that absolutely was not the case? Well, they wanted to make it seem like the German government was doing something positive by bringing a stable civilization to these regions. And it's ridiculous to say, but Africa was ground zero for a lot of this racist stuff that was going on between European nations primarily and the African people. Even in India, you guys covered the Sepoy Mutiny. The Sepoys, as shown in the image on the left with the governor here, was represented as kind of, remember, he was an Indian mercenary that covered their security for their companies. But the British government felt like they were their little pets that would do everything in their bidding, and they were kind of like these violent animals, but they could be controlled. If you look at the Sepoy on the left, he's got his bare feet, but these daggers with blood on them. But yet, it's almost like the British little pet, as far as they can keep them under wraps. And, representation of how the British would react to the Sepoy Mutiny, even considering that during the Sepoy Mutiny, it was the British who required the Sepoys to use pig and cow meat or pig and cow grease for their rifle cartridges, which naturally was against Hindu and Muslim religions, yet they didn't care. They disregarded their culture and forced it on them. And in return, they show this white woman, almost a woman with angelic qualities, stepping on Indians and giving it almost like it's his God's vengeance in some ways. But making it seem like the Indians were the aggressors, which, in most cases was definitely not true. And even images of Japan. Japan actually attained power similar, if not greater, to some of the industrial powers and imperial powers of Europe, yet was never truly accepted because they were from Asia. They had a different religion. They looked different than Europeans. So this picture was one of many that showed like Japanese emissaries, the emperor trying to fit in with Western nations, but the Western nations never truly would accept them as an equal, which would be their own undoing because later on in the 1930s and 40s, Japan ended up acquiring one of the largest empires of all the nations in the world. We'll stay tuned for that. And this is probably the most glaring, and it's one of the more common ones that you'll see in the history classes, is this portrayal of Uncle Sam and John Bull, the kind of British Uncle Sam, taking these people that are portrayed horribly with just racist images, that they have to carry these people over these boulders, these challenges, these obstacles. And if you look at the boulders, they all list things that get in the way of achieving ultimate civilization, which is showing up at the top of the mountain. So all these things really play into that factor that Westerners had to bear this responsibility, and these people needed them in order to live a better life, because the life they were living in their countries now was not that similar to the Western culture that was more advanced and, in their eyes, superior. Now, there were setbacks to this. There were uprisings in Africa and Asia. In Ethiopia, there was a major uprising there, the Battle of Adwa. And then there were critics at home as well. Some people called it out back in European nations, said this is just a tool for rich people to make more money. You're going to take over other countries and exploit the workers there to make more financial gain. And many said that imperialists were hypocrites, that despite the fact they were preaching that they were going to do all these great things for these people that they were coming into contact with, the truth of the matter, they weren't bringing democracy to them. They were stripping any means of democracy from them. So many people call them hypocrites. Now, you also see the maps. You look at how the maps change where of European controlled areas from 1700 into 1914, and don't mind China and Russia because they're not really technically included this, but if you look around the shoreline, India, Burma, Siam, Vietnam, the Dutch East Indies, Philippines, Japan, and Korea, all controlled by 1914 by some form of European power or Japan. And then ground zero, Africa, 1878. There were some influences from Europe, and mostly along the coastline, but with new medicine that affected malaria. By 1914, after the Berlin Conference, the scramble for Africa had scooped up every nation except two in Africa. Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two remaining independent nations in Africa by the outset of World War One. Crazy to think about, and that you're looking at a 36-year span that this entire continent is completely engulfed by imperial powers. So by 1914, as we said in the previous PowerPoint, 85% of the world was controlled by imperial nations. Crazy to think. And ultimately, this is one of the reasons, this competition over territory, that sparks World War One. So reviewing motives and effects, we know that your imperial nations exploited resources of regions for economic gain, as the cartoon kind of shows here. They exerted dominance economically and militarily across the globe. And finally, what we cover today is, in most cases, these imperial powers disregarded native cultures and governments. And the reason they did it, they felt it was their responsibility to westernize the rest of the world. That's it for today. Thank you.